coalition has slashed the country's reduction target for biogenic methane, a significant change that weakens the Crown's climate commitments. The government says it's a necessary step to give farmers certainty.
There are no winners here, but for the first time there are also no losers.
While critics argue it reverses good progress on New Zealand's climate ambitions.
We're basically saying to other countries, well, you need to work harder because we're not going to.
What does a lower biogenic methane reduction target actually mean? Is it really, as the coalition suggests, scientific? And why have politicians kicked the can down the road again on pricing agricultural methane emissions when everyone else pays their way? Kia ora, ko Anneke Smith aho, anei te pūrongo tō rangapū o tēnei wiki. Welcome to Focus on Politics. Like many other nations, New Zealand is grappling with the impacts of climate change, and the 3-year election cycle means the Crown's response can swing like a pendulum. Back in 2019, there was near-unanimous political consensus for the country's climate targets. Then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern thanking National for voting with Labour on the Zero Carbon Act.
We have to be unified in the fight against climate change. We have made a choice that I am proud of, that will leave a legacy, and that I hope means the next generation will see that we, in New Zealand, were on the right side of history.
The legislation holds two big climate targets: net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and a 24 to 47% reduction below 2017 levels of biogenic methane emissions by 2050. This is a split target approach because, unlike carbon dioxide that lasts for a millennia, methane is a short-lived gas that lasts about a decade on average. Both figures were set within the context of a global intention of keeping warming to within 1.5 degrees by 2050. The coalition has long signalled it would change this second target, and it's now done that. Climate Change Minister Simon Watts says the first range was unrealistic.
It is really, really important as a government that we want to provide certainty to our agricultural sector, and the adjustment that we're making in terms of changing the methane target to 14 to 24% we believe is a fair and pragmatic target for agriculture to contribute its part around emissions reduction in New Zealand.
There are diverging views from politicians and scientists on the merits of this move. More on that later. But first, we delve into how the government got to this 14 to 24% reduction range. The coalition set up a ministerial advisory panel to review the methane target last June. Panel member Professor David Frame explains the group's remit was a specific one, only looking at agricultural methane emissions through a no additional warming lens.
So they worked from warming, 2017 warming. I don't know why they picked 2017. I think it had something to do with a reference point in the Zero Carbon Act already or something like that. We were told to what level of cuts are consistent with not exceeding 2017 levels of warming from agricultural methane in New Zealand. And so we just solved that problem. We got the same answer as 3 or 4 other groups who've looked at that in the past.
This methane panel is important because it's the basis on which the coalition says the new targets are science-based. It's meant that Trade Minister Todd McClay can say the coalition is backing the facts, as he did when interviewed by Corin Dan on Morning Report on Monday.
Why has the government ignored the advice of the Independent Climate Change Commission, as well as, in fact, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment on this issue?
Well, no, we haven't done that. We've taken a range of views, including science, and you mentioned the independent review that was done. They came up with a scenario of a 14 to 24% reduction needed against additional warming. We've always been really clear. We want New Zealand farmers to do their bit. They will be doing that. But we've also said we're not going to close down farms and send jobs and production to less carbon-efficient countries overseas, because that's not good for climate, and it's really not good for the New Zealand economy.
The no additional warming approach was rejected outright by the Climate Change Commission in its 2024 advice. It warned adopting the principle would mean more warming overall or require steeper, costlier cuts in carbon dioxide and other gases to compensate. The Commission said a no additional warming approach doesn't give a clear answer to target setting that's based on science. Quote, "We've found no reasons to relax Aotearoa New Zealand's contribution to global efforts and no significant change that would justify causing even more warming than under the current target." End quote. Even against this backdrop, Professor David Frame says the lower target is reasonable under the circumstances.
1.5 degrees about to go zooming by, and everybody accepts that, I think. It's sad and it's not great, but I think it was always a bit of a mistake to hardwire in legislative targets around the 1.5 degree, the lower end of the Paris Agreement target range, just because it was never very plausible. And I think one of the problems the Ardern government had was that it didn't do a regulatory impact statement on what that target would do to New Zealand, but Treasury and MB and others opposed it, and it was never very realistic. So they kind of plucked that target because I think it was ambitious, but I don't think it was particularly well thought through. And now you're seeing a bunch of other countries and entities who made ambitious pronouncements a few years ago begin to see the writing on the wall.
Ex-leader David Seymour is taking credit for the weakened target as the only MP who voted against the Zero Carbon Act in 2019.
I voted alone against the entire Parliament when these targets were introduced. I'm thrilled 7 years later to see a reality check. It makes no sense to drive New Zealand farmers out of business so their competitors overseas can serve the same customers with higher emissions. That's the definition of a lose-lose. New Zealand First's leader Winston Peters says there's no point in bankrupting the country when the biggest international polluters aren't pulling their weight.
How come we've got 4 countries that are guilty of 60% of the emissions and 191 countries trying to get there in terms of the international plan signed up in Paris? Pray tell me that. I raised it at the United Nations. They admit this is a serious matter. Now it's your job to tell the country how we can possibly do anything about this when 4 countries are guilty of 60% of the emissions.
Farming groups have also celebrated the new methane target. Here's Kate Ackland from Beef and Lamb and Wayne Langford from Federated Farmers.
New Zealand produces food for 40 million people, and we are amongst the world's most efficient producers of protein. So if that protein is not being produced here in New Zealand, where we have really efficient farmers, it will be produced somewhere else in the world. And, on a global sense, for global warming, if that production goes to a less efficient country or a less efficient producer, that's a bad thing.
I think what's really important here is to understand just how far off the last lot of targets were. So 24 to 47%. It was going to put well over 20% of sheep and beef farms out of business, 6 or 7% of dairy farms out of business. It was literally going to destroy rural communities. That's why farmers have fought so hard to get this for review, get them right and get them scientifically based.
The opposition Labour Party is not so thrilled. Damien O'Connor, a former agriculture minister, says the celebrations are short-sighted.
The farmers who might be celebrating this in the short term will be the ones who will be coming to government in the future asking for support for disasters that are caused by global warming. We all have to do our bit. New Zealand's capable of doing more than the government's put before the farmers, and that's a lost opportunity in my view.
But Labour won't commit to restoring the biogenic methane target to its original range if re-elected.
We have to work out what is the best thing to do as a small country, a food-producing country, to both show leadership but to give effect to reduction in global warming. I think the government's position with methane as no further warming is a Neanderthal one. It is really ignoring the reality that we came to this country, we've cleared most of the vegetation on it to create farmland, we've contributed to global warming. We should and we have a responsibility to actually contribute to a reduction, not just a continuation of the status quo.
More than 1,000 leaders, scientists and decision-makers from around the world gathered in Christchurch for a conference on adaptation this week. Professor of Climate Science and climate researcher James Renwick was there.
The topic is adaptation, that is, how do we respond to the way the climate's changing? Well, at the moment, yes, we can adapt most of the time in most places. Ex-tropical cyclone Gabrielle, I was just heard a talk today about, well, what if that had actually run straight over the top of Auckland? What might have happened then? At some point, we will start to get impacts that we can't adapt to. So we can talk about adaptation now, but unless we get on top of the emissions, we won't be able to adapt anymore, and that's the real worry, and that's when things really start to break down.
Professor Renwick says weakening the country's biogenic methane target is just wrong, and politicians' concerns higher emitting countries would simply pick up any slack in the markets is overstated.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about that, this idea of leakage, Actually, the Climate Change Commission looked pretty closely at this when they were developing their advice to government, and their conclusions were that this is a really minor problem. It basically doesn't happen. Other countries do their own thing regardless of what we're doing, so I really don't think it's an issue.
Scientists have shared varied perspectives on the pros and cons of a lower biogenic methane target, but all seem to agree the world is on track to shoot past the 1.5-degree target. James Renwick says the global context still doesn't excuse moral culpability.
We are about to zoom past the 1.5-degree limit, and countries have pulled back. But that doesn't make it right. We really need to redouble our efforts. That's like saying, oh, well, we're going to have catastrophic climate change. Well, we just have to accept that. Actually, no, we don't. Humanity, us, we're the ones making it happen. We can stop it happening if we just turn off the tap of emissions. And just saying, oh, it's all a bit hard is rather defeatist. It's not a very positive attitude. The panel that the government set up to advise them on all this, they were asked, what emissions reductions would be required to lead to no additional warming. That was the thing they were asked to do. So they weren't given a brief to have a wide-ranging look at what should happen with methane emissions. That was the Climate Change Commission. The answer was already set up in the question. So yes, they did what they were asked, but that doesn't mean they were asked the right question.
Biogenic methane target aside, Professor David Frame points out the coalition has also scrapped an agricultural methane tax. He's critical of this, saying the government has missed an opportunity on pricing.
I think if they'd been a little more far-sighted, they could have put a small price on agricultural methane emissions, and then they would have been in a position, one, to say to the rest of the world, look, we have a price on agricultural methane emissions and you don't. And that is a form of leadership, actual practical policy leadership, not just grand pronouncements about what the world will be like in 2050, which are pretty meaningless, to be honest. So I think it was a missed opportunity there. And I also think they could have gone some way to assuaging the concerns of people who think this is a retrenchment from climate policy by doing that. If you said, look, I'm going to weaken these grand promises about what the world will be like in 2050, but I'm going to do something now and spend some political capital, then that's actually quite powerful.
Here's Professor James Renwick again.
Well, I agree with him on that. It's one thing we do agree on. That I think price signals are known to be really effective ways to change people's behaviour. If it's going to cost you money, you'll do something else. So I think, we should be pricing methane. What that price should be is another question, but there should be a price. It shouldn't be free.
The government argues taxing agricultural methane emissions risks closing down farms and sending jobs and production overseas. Instead, it's looking to reduce methane to meet the country's targets in partnership with farmers, following the lead of companies like Fonterra and Silver Fern Farms. The coalition is investing with industry to speed up the development and rollout of methane-cutting tools, like new pond treatment systems that can cut effluent emissions by more than 90%. Earth Sciences New Zealand's principal scientist, Dr. Jocelyn Turnbull, says new technologies are great, but methane comes from other sources too, and an and approach is best.
The report talks a lot about the effort that have gone into trying to develop and implement methane vaccines and other types of things that can reduce the amount of methane coming from individual animals, particularly from cows. And there's been a huge amount of progress on that, which is pretty exciting. But another point that isn't really highlighted very much that I think we should think about is the other places that we can reduce methane and also CO2. So for methane in New Zealand, about 90% of the emissions are coming from agriculture. The other 10% is coming from landfills, wastewater, and natural gas leakage. And those are all things that we already know how to mitigate. And when we mitigate them, they're win-win. So for example, natural gas leakage, natural gas is mostly methane. When there's leaks out of pipelines, that goes into the atmosphere and warms. If you go around and you look more often to check for leaks and find them and fix them, you can reduce the methane emissions from that source. And of course, the natural gas companies are no longer putting that methane into the atmosphere, so they're making more money. So there's really good solutions that we know how to tackle that we should think about. And on the other side, for the agricultural industry, for farmers and agricultural businesses, methane isn't the only thing that they produce. There's CO2 as well, right? So CO2 coming from transportation and from energy use, particularly things like milk factories that are using a lot of energy to make milk powder. And we know how to mitigate those by using renewables and by using electric vehicles. So there's really an opportunity to make a difference in those other ways right now.
In the meantime, National's coalition partners New Zealand First and ACT have been questioning the merits of New Zealand being in the Paris Accord. With that in mind, the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, was asked whether New Zealanders could really be confident that the country would stay signed up.
Parties may form their own views as they go into an election campaign next year, but I just say to you, in a three-party coalition government, which is what I lead, and speaking from a National Party point of view, but certainly from a government point of view, we've made the determination as a government with the three parties that actually staying in Paris is important to us.
The government will legislate its new biogenic methane target before the end of the year, with a plan to review it in 2040. That was Focus on Politics. I'm Anneke Smith. Thanks for joining us. Mā te wā.